This is a Squiz podcast. We're your shortcut to being informed.
New laws for combating mis and disinformation are being considered in our federal parliament and generating quite a bit of chat on talkback radio and elsewhere. So in this Squiz Shortcut, we'll take a look at what these laws are trying to achieve and why the legislation is controversial. Squiz Shortcuts is the backstory to the big news stories. I'm Andrew Williams.
And I'm Claire Kimball.
Claire, mis and disinformation is a big topic. Probably warrants a couple of definitions right off the bat so we know what we're talking about.
Yeah, I think that's fair enough. So misinformation is something someone or some entity gets wrong. Disinformation has intent behind it. Is someone or something deliberately trying to mislead us?
And they're not new concepts. They've been around basically forever. But this is a conversation that is supercharged right now because we are in an era of digital communications where content is being generated at a volume that we've never seen before.
No, we've never had so much information coming at us, and gone are the days of only professionally created content coming at us. So like news outlets being the gatekeepers of information essentially. Now anyone with a smartphone, a social media account and a dream can use the tools to communicate with very large audiences.
And that can also include state actors, so people working on behalf of a government who might target people somewhere else to sow the seeds of chaos. We've seen that in recent elections, particularly in the US. So that brings us to efforts by the Albanese government to clamp down on mis and disinformation, and it might help to understand where are we starting from.
Yeah, so currently there is a voluntary code of conduct in place. Those big social media and tech companies are required to keep an eye on their platforms. And if they think that content that is on their platforms falls under this banner of mis or disinformation, they might choose to place warning labels on that content or make it less accessible. They can actually push it down the algorithm so it doesn't serve to those people who are using those platforms, or they might remove it altogether.
And as with any voluntary code of conduct, the key word there is voluntary. Yeah. It's a very important word.
It really is. But the Albanese government wants to make that code of conduct mandatory, so they would be forced to adhere by a set of guidelines. And what it would do is give the Australian Communications Media Authority, or ACMA or ACMA, the power to impose fines on the tech companies of up to 5% of their global revenue if they breach these new laws.
And that means billions of dollars, because we're talking about companies like Meta, which controls Instagram and Facebook and Threads. We've got Elon Musk's X, TikTok, Google, Microsoft. There's a lot of money in this space.
A lot of money in this space, and they are very big companies that are very powerful and more powerful, it seems. So what could happen is that these new laws get up and those companies would have to publish their policies and keep records about how they deal with cases of mis and disinformation.
And we witnessed some of those issues with the current voluntary regime play out in the stoush between our e-safety commissioner, Julie Inman-Grant, and Elon Musk's X. Earlier this year, when she tried to have content related to the Wakely stabbing attack taken down, not just in Australia, but also internationally, on the basis that it constituted extreme violence.
Yeah, that's right. But the federal court found that she didn't have the authority to make that demand and that her request basically amounted to censorship. So that case was dropped. She's since said that she supports these laws that the Albanese government has put forward.
And they're being driven by the Communications Minister, Michelle Rowland, who says the new laws aren't there for ACMA to go after individuals or to take down posts. She says they're just meant to force the tech companies to tidy up their own backyards, and that they'll protect Australians from information that is, in her words, seriously harmful and verifiably false.
Yeah, and it's on the seriously harmful category that probably warrants the most concern from the critics. The examples are that posts that turn people against, for example, community health measures like vaccines, or that encourage the destruction of infrastructure like phone towers, again, based on information that is not correct or is untrue. So what Michelle Rowland has also said is that the new laws would ward off threats to our democracy. So So those malicious state actors that we talked about just a second ago.
But there are critics of the bill, as you say, and they say that the real threat to our democracy comes not from rogue states, but from these exact laws. So up next, we're going to look at why people are so concerned about it. Claire, the proposed mis and disinformation laws have started a debate about freedom of speech in Australia, with some politicians saying the bill is draconian and similar to the kind of policies that are currently in place in China.
Yeah, and when they talk about China, that's not a compliment. It is actually saying that the Chinese state does crack down on the sort of information that their citizens are able to access. So they say that that's not appropriate in a democracy like Australia. And where it all comes unstuck is this definition of misinformation and what is deemed to cause serious harm, because it isn't just about the content that's proven to be false. Things like financial scams or false celebrity endorsements or photos that have been digitally altered. It extends to opinions and to commentary as well.
And when you get into the area of opinions and commentary, you get into a very tricky area determining what is false or what is seriously harmful. And the Coalition and some crossbenchers in the Senate say that aspect of the bill is far too broad. It leaves no room for alternate points of view, which they say basically amounts to or adds up to censorship.
So the Coalition spokesperson on communications is David Coleman. He says that the legislation as it currently stands will give the digital platforms, and this is his quote, an enormous financial incentive to censor statements made by everyday Australians. But there are some exclusions to the bill, so just to clock those: news, parody, satire, and content for academic, artistic, scientific or religious purposes. They're all exempt from this legislation. But some academics have also been critical of the legislation.
Yes, it's not just political opponents that have some issues with the bill. There's constitutional law expert Anne Toomey. She says that the chances of a digital platform being able to distinguish which content is which would be very low. And so the result would be probably over censorship, in that they're just kind of getting rid of anything that they're worried about.
Yeah, and the thought behind that is that the platforms would just dump anything that's contentious into this sort of bucket of misinformation, just to be on the safe side and to avoid being fined. So David Coleman says digital platforms don't care about free speech in Australia, but they do care about their profits.
And as we record this podcast, the legislation is before the Senate. Senators Lydia Thorpe, Fatima Payman and David Pocock are some who won't support it. So that means it'll need support from the Greens and several other crossbenchers in order for the Albanese government to actually get it over the line and get it passed.
What a cliffhanger, Andrew. It's all up in the air. And I guess the thing to know about all of that is that the government is aiming to have it done this year. So in the coming week and a half or so, it's one to keep an eye on.
Yes, the time is running out. The clock is counting down very, very quickly for the Albanese government on this one. So that's our shortcut to the proposed new mis and disinformation laws. On to some recommendations. Before we wrap up, I have one recommendation for you. It's an interview that the Sydney radio host Ben Fordham did with the Communications Minister, Michelle Rowland, about these new laws. He pressed her on a couple of points. I reckon it's well worth a listen to get an idea of what it's all about. I'll put links to that in the episode notes. Thank you very much for listening, and remember to share this episode with your mates who want to hear the backstory to the big news stories. And don't forget, if you've got an idea for a future Squiz Shortcut, we love to hear them. We love to hear from you. Just flick it through to hello@thesquiz.com.au. Until next time.